Blood soaked into the dusty earth of the Anderson silver mine as Katherine Nash stared at the note in her trembling hands, the words blurring through her tears. 6 years of marriage erased by a hastily scrawled confession. Thomas had fled with the mine payroll, the company nurse, and every cent of their savings, leaving nothing but debts and broken promises behind. Colorado Territory, 1873. Katherine had followed her husband west from Boston with dreams of prosperity, only to watch those dreams crumble in the unforgiving shadow of the Rocky Mountains. Now, as the October wind whipped through her thin calico dress, she stood outside the small cabin that had been their home, a foreclosure notice nailed to the door. Mrs. Nash. The voice came from behind her, deep and unfamiliar. Katherine quickly wiped her tears, squared her shoulders, and turned. A tall man sat atop a chestnut stallion, his face partially shadowed by a well-worn Stetson. His clothes were dusty but well-kept dark trousers tucked into leather boots, a blue shirt beneath a weathered suede vest. Not the typical silver miner's attire. "Yes," she replied, forcing steadiness into her voice, "though I'm not sure how much longer that name will serve me." The stranger dismounted with fluid grace that belied his size. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 or so, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. A thin scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into several days' worth of stubble. "Xavier Lawson," he introduced himself with a slight tip of his hat. "I run the Double L Ranch about 5 miles east of here." Word spreading about what happened. Katherine felt heat rise to her cheeks. Of course it was. In a place like Loveland, Colorado, news, especially the scandalous kind, traveled faster than a prairie fire. "Then you know my situation, Mr. Lawson," she said stiffly. "My husband has abandoned his responsibilities, his debts, and his wife. The mine owners have given me until sundown to vacate their property." Xavier's gaze swept over the small pile of belongings. Katherine had managed to salvage a trunk containing her clothes, a few books, her mother's silver hand mirror, and little else. Thomas had taken everything of value, including the wagon and horses. "Where will you go?" he asked, no judgment in his tone. Katherine lifted her chin. "I'm considering my options." In truth, she had none. The stagecoach required fare she didn't have, and the town of Loveland offered few opportunities for a woman alone, especially one tainted by scandal. "Mrs. Nash," Xavier said carefully, removing his hat, "I've come to offer you a proposition." Katherine stiffened, immediately wary. She knew what kinds of propositions awaited vulnerable women. "Mr. Lawson, I may be destitute, but I'm not without dignity." To her surprise, a flush crept up his neck. "No, madam, nothing improper. I need a housekeeper at the Double L. It's a respectable position with fair wages, a private room, and meals included. My last housekeeper left to get married last month, and bachelor cooking is wearing thin on me and my men." Katherine studied him, searching for deceit in those storm cloud eyes and finding none. Still, she hesitated. "The alternative," Xavier continued gently, "is staying in town, where folks might be less than charitable given the circumstances." He was right. Already she'd seen the sidelong glances, heard the whispered comments. The wives pitied her at best, despised her at worst, as if Thomas's infidelity somehow reflected on her failings as a woman. "Why would you help me?" Katherine asked bluntly. Xavier replaced his hat, adjusting it slightly. "My mother was left in similar straits when my father died." A neighbor's kindness made all the difference. He paused. "Besides, I truly do need a housekeeper, and you need somewhere to go. Seems straightforward enough." Katherine glanced at the setting sun, then at her meager possessions. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. "Very well, Mr. Lawson," she said with as much dignity as she could muster. "I accept your offer, though I should warn you my cooking skills are modest at best." For the first time, Xavier Lawson smiled, transforming his solemn face. "Can't be worse than cookies. Man tried to serve us leather biscuits this morning." He loaded her trunk onto his horse with ease that spoke of a lifetime of physical labor. Then, to Catherine's surprise, he offered his hand to help her mount. "You want me to ride with you?" she asked, eyeing the distance to the ground. "Unless you'd prefer to walk 5 miles in those," he replied, nodding toward her impractical town shoes. Catherine gathered her skirts and allowed him to boost her onto the saddle. Xavier swung up behind her, maintaining a respectful distance despite the intimacy of their arrangement. As they rode away from the mine that had been her home, Catherine didn't look back. There was nothing left for her there but broken promises and bitter memories. The journey to the Double L Ranch took them through rolling grasslands bathed in the golden light of sunset. Catherine's body gradually relaxed as the rhythmic movement of the horse and the solid presence behind her lulled her into an exhausted calm. Xavier remained silent, seeming to understand her need to process all that had happened. When they crested a final hill, the Double L spread before them a sprawling ranch house with a wide porch, flanked by a barn, bunkhouse, and various outbuildings. Lamplight glowed warmly from the windows, and smoke curled from the chimney against the darkening sky. "It's not much compared to what you might be used to back east," Xavier said, misinterpreting her silence. "It's lovely," Catherine replied honestly. After the cramped, drafty cabin at the mine, the ranch house looked like paradise. As they approached, several men emerged from the bunkhouse, curious about their boss's companion. Catherine felt their eyes on her, assessing, wondering. Xavier dismounted first, then reached up to help her down. His hands were strong at her waist, steadying her as her feet touched the ground. "Mrs. Nash will be our new housekeeper," he announced to the gathered men, his tone brooking no argument or improper comment. "I expect you all to show her the same respect you'd show your own mothers and sisters." A chorus of "yes, boss," and nods followed as the men removed their hats in greeting. An older man with a white beard stepped forward. "Welcome to the Double L, madam. I'm Samuel, ranch foreman. These hooligans might look rough, but they've got decent manners when reminded." His kind eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "Thank you, Samuel," Catherine replied, grateful for the warm reception. Xavier carried her trunk into the house, leading her through a comfortable parlor to a small but tidy bedroom off the kitchen. A patchwork quilt covered the bed, and lace curtains framed a window that would catch the morning light. "This will be your room," he said, setting down her trunk. "Bathrooms down the hall, kitchen's through there." He pointed to a doorway. "I usually take breakfast at sunrise, dinner at midday, and supper after the day's work. The men eat in the bunkhouse except for Sundays, when we all dine together." Catherine nodded, trying to memorize the information despite her exhaustion. Xavier seemed to notice her fatigue. "You must be tired. There's bread and cold ham in the pantry if you're hungry. We can sort out the rest tomorrow." "Mr. Lawson," Catherine said as he turned to leave. "Thank you. I won't forget this kindness." Something flickered in his eyes, something warm that made her heart flutter unexpectedly. "Get some rest, Mrs. Nash. Tomorrow's a new beginning." After he left, Catherine sat heavily on the bed, the events of the day crashing over her. For 6 years, she'd been Thomas's wife, her identity bound to his. Now she was alone in a stranger's home, dependent on his charity. The unfairness of it burned like bile in her throat, but beneath the bitterness lay something else, a tiny seed of possibility. For the first time since she'd followed Thomas west, She was free to determine her own path. As Katherine unpacked her few possessions, placing her mother's silver mirror on the small dresser, she made a silent vow. She would never again put her fate in a man's hands. Little did she know how difficult that vow would be to keep. The rooster's crow jolted Katherine awake. For a moment, she stared in confusion at the unfamiliar ceiling, the events of the previous day rushing back with painful clarity. Thomas, the mine, the debts, Xavier Lawson. Morning light streamed through the lace curtains as she hastily dressed in her second-best dress, a practical navy cotton with white piping. Her trunk contained precious few clothes suitable for housekeeping, but she'd make do until she earned enough to supplement her wardrobe. The kitchen was larger than she'd expected, with a massive cast iron stove, a sturdy wooden table, and well-stocked shelves. Katherine took inventory as she stoked the fire and put on coffee. By the time heavy footsteps approached, she had biscuits in the oven and bacon sizzling in the skillet. Xavier paused in the doorway, clearly surprised to find breakfast underway. His hair was damp from washing, and he'd shaved, revealing a strong jawline previously hidden by stubble. "Good morning, Mr. Lawson," Katherine said briskly, trying to ignore how the morning light emphasized the blue-gray of his eyes. "Coffee's ready if you'd like some." "You didn't need to start so early," he replied, accepting the cup she offered. "I'd have given you a day to settle in." "I prefer to earn my keep from the outset," she said, turning back to the stove. "Besides, I couldn't sleep past that rooster's announcement," Xavier chuckled. "Old Rufus believes in punctuality." He took a sip of coffee and raised his eyebrows. "This is good, strong." "My father believed weak coffee was a moral failing," Katherine said, surprising herself with the personal revelation. "Smart man," Xavier commented, settling at the table as Katherine served him a plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits. "What did your father do?" "He was a professor at Harvard." "Literature." Katherine busied herself at the stove, avoiding Xavier's gaze. Her father had disowned her when she'd married Thomas against his wishes. The irony wasn't lost on her. "And you came west with your husband," Xavier stated, not a question. "Thomas had grand visions of silver mines and fortune," Katherine replied, her tone carefully neutral. "The reality proved somewhat less glittering." Xavier ate in thoughtful silence for a moment. "You're educated, then?" Katherine nodded. "More than was considered necessary for a woman, according to my mother. Yet you agreed to be my housekeeper." "Circumstances narrow one's options considerably, Mr. Lawson." Katherine finally sat down across from him with her own plate. "But I'm grateful for the opportunity, truly." Xavier studied her, his expression unreadable. "Well, your breakfast suggests I made a good decision. These biscuits are excellent. Better than leather at any rate," Katherine replied with a small smile. The unexpected sound of Xavier's laugh warmed something inside her that had been cold for a very long time. After breakfast, Xavier showed Katherine around the ranch house, a tour that revealed a home sorely in need of a woman's touch. While clean enough, the rooms had a Spartan quality that spoke of bachelor living. The parlor held a comfortable sofa and chairs, but lacked the small touches that made a house a home. The dining room was functional but formal. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms stood empty except for the master, which Xavier occupied. "My parents built this house planning for a large family," he explained, a shadow crossing his face. "It didn't work out that way." "It's a beautiful home," Katherine said sincerely. "With good bones, as my grandmother would say." Xavier's room was neat, but distinctly masculine, a large 4-poster bed with a simple quilt, a chest of drawers, and a desk covered with ranch paperwork. A bookshelf caught Katherine's eye, filled with an eclectic collection that included Shakespeare, Mark Twain, and several volumes on cattle breeding. "You're a reader," she observed with surprise. "Winter nights get long," Xavier replied with a shrug. "Feel free to borrow anything that interests you." The tour concluded in the small study off the main parlor, where ledgers and papers were stacked in precarious piles. "This is my attempt at keeping the ranch accounts," Xavier said ruefully. "I'm better with cattle than columns of numbers." Katherine examined one of the ledgers, noting the careful but somewhat disorganized entries. "I could help with this, if you'd like. I kept the books for my father's household." Xavier looked relieved. "I'd appreciate that. We can discuss additional compensation for bookkeeping duties." "That won't be necessary," Katherine began, but Xavier shook his head. "I pay fair wages for work done, Mrs. Nash. That includes yours." His tone was firm but kind. As they returned to the kitchen, Katherine felt an unexpected sense of purpose taking root. Perhaps this arrangement, born of desperation, might offer more than just sanctuary. The days fell into a rhythm. Katherine rose before dawn to prepare breakfast for Xavier and a hearty midday meal for the ranch hands. Afternoons were spent cleaning, mending, and gradually transforming the ranch house into a true home. In the evenings, after serving supper, she often helped Xavier with the ranch accounts, their heads bent together over columns of figures by lamplight. October gave way to November, bringing colder temperatures and the first dusting of snow to the Colorado foothills. Katherine found herself settling into life at the Double L with surprising ease. The ranch hands treated her with respect, even affection, especially after she mastered the art of sourdough bread and apple pie. One evening, as the first serious snowfall blanketed the ranch, Katherine sat in the parlor darning socks by the fire. Xavier entered, stamping snow from his boots. "Going to be a cold one," he remarked, warming his hands by the fire. The men got the cattle moved to the sheltered pasture just in time. Katherine nodded, continuing her mending. "I've put extra blankets in all the upstairs bedrooms. They'll be there if needed." Xavier settled into the armchair across from her, watching as her needle flashed in the firelight. "You've changed this place," he said after a long moment. Katherine glanced up, unsure if the observation was positive or negative. "I hope for the better. Definitely for the better." Xavier's voice was warm. "It feels like a home again." The simple compliment pleased Katherine more than it should have. "Thank you. It's been nice having a purpose." "Were you very unhappy at the mine?" Xavier asked, his expression contemplative. Katherine considered the question, her needle pausing. "Not at first. I believed in Thomas's dreams as much as he did. But as time passed and the promised fortunes failed to materialize, things changed." "He changed," Xavier said quietly. Katherine nodded, resuming her darning. "Success eluded him. He began drinking, gambling. I made excuses, of course. Then I discovered he'd been seeing the company nurse for months." She hadn't intended to reveal so much, but something about the cozy room, the falling snow, and Xavier's attentive silence made it easy to speak freely. "I confronted him, and he promised it was over. I believed him like a fool." Katherine's voice hardened. 2 days later, he was gone with her and everything we had. "That doesn't make you a fool," Xavier said, leaning forward. "It makes him a coward and a scoundrel." Katherine looked up, meeting Xavier's gaze. The fierce protectiveness she saw there made her breath catch. "Most people in town believe I failed as a wife, that I drove him away." Xavier's jaw tightened. "Most people in town don't deserve your concern." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the crackling fire and the soft sound of Katherine's needle through fabric. "What about you?" she finally asked. "You built this ranch, but you never married." A shadow crossed Xavier's face. "I was engaged once." Eleanor was the daughter of a Denver banker. We met at a cattle auction, of all places. A small smile touched his lips at the memory. She loved the idea of ranch life, the romance of it, at least. "What happened?" Katherine prompted gently when he fell silent. "Influenza." 5 years ago this winter. Xavier's voice was flat. "We were to be married in the spring." "I'm so sorry," Katherine said softly, understanding now why he'd been so willing to help a stranger in need. He knew what it was to lose everything. Xavier nodded his acknowledgement. "After a leaner, I threw myself into building the ranch. It's grown every year. The men call me a hard boss, but a fair one. That's enough." But Katherine wondered if it was enough, really. The ranch house had too many empty bedrooms for a man resigned to solitude. The books on his shelves spoke of a mind seeking connection. And sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, she caught an expression of profound loneliness on his face that mirrored what she felt in her own heart. "It's getting late," Xavier said, rising from his chair. "Thank you for the company, Mrs. Nash." "Katherine," she said impulsively. "You might as well call me Katherine after I've shared your home for over a month." Xavier paused at the parlor door, something flickering in his eyes. "Good night, Katherine. Sleep well." "Good night, Xavier," she replied, testing the shape of his name on her lips. After he left, Katherine sat motionless, her mending forgotten in her lap. Something had shifted between them tonight, something subtle but undeniable. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. She'd vowed never again to put her fate in a man's hands. But her heart, it seemed, had other ideas. Winter settled over Loveland with a vengeance. Katherine adapted to ranch life, learning to cook on the temperamental wood stove and keep the house warm against the bitter cold. Xavier spent long days working with the cattle, often returning with frost in his beard and exhaustion in his eyes. Katherine took to having hot coffee waiting for him, along with stew simmering on the stove. Their evening conversations by the fire became a cherished ritual, ranging from literature to politics to Xavier's plans for expanding the ranch. Katherine found herself looking forward to these quiet hours, when the day's work was done, and they could simply enjoy each other's company. As Christmas approached, Katherine realized she'd saved enough from her wages to purchase small gifts. On her monthly trip into town for supplies now made without Xavier's escort, as she'd grown more confident, she selected practical items for the ranch hands. New gloves, pipes, tobacco pouches. For Xavier, she lingered longer, finally settling on a leather-bound journal she'd noticed him admiring in the general store window. The purchase nearly depleted her savings, but the thought of his pleasure made it worthwhile. The shopping trip also brought her first encounter with town gossip about her position at the Double L. As Katherine selected fabric for new curtains, she overheard two women whispering. "Living under the same roof, just the two of them. It's scandalous," one murmured. "Well, what can you expect from a woman whose husband ran off?" the other replied. "Lawson's a fool if he thinks she's just keeping his house." Katherine's cheeks burned, but she held her head high as she completed her purchases. The storekeeper, at least, treated her with courtesy, perhaps influenced by the substantial business the Double L brought his way. That evening, Katherine was unusually quiet as she served dinner. Xavier noticed immediately. Something happened in town. He asked, his perceptiveness catching her off guard. Katherine considered deflecting but opted for honesty. "I overheard some unkind speculation about my position here." Xavier's expression darkened. "What did they say?" "Nothing worth repeating," Katherine replied, focusing on her plate. "It's to be expected, I suppose. A widow or good as living in a bachelor's home." "You're my housekeeper," Xavier said firmly. "Anyone suggesting otherwise insults both of us." "In fairness," Katherine said with a wry smile, "most housekeepers don't spend their evenings discussing Thoreau with their employers." Xavier's anger softened into something warmer. Their loss, then. On Christmas Eve, the ranch hands gathered in the main house for dinner, a tradition Xavier explained had been started by his parents. Katherine had spent days preparing, roasting 2 turkeys, baking pies, and decorating the house with pine boughs and red ribbons. The dining room rang with laughter and conversation as the men, cleaned up and in their Sunday best, enjoyed the feast. Katherine found herself genuinely enjoying their company, these rough men who had accepted her into their world without judgment. After dinner, Samuel produced a fiddle, and impromptu dancing commenced in the cleared parlor. Katherine watched from the doorway, smiling as the men took turns partnering each other, exaggerating feminine steps to general hilarity. "May I have this dance?" Xavier's voice came from beside her, surprising Katherine. It's been years since I danced," she admitted. "Fortunately, it's like riding a horse," Xavier replied with a smile. "You never truly forget." He led her into the center of the room as Samuel struck up a waltz. The ranch hands cleared space, watching with interest as their boss placed one hand at Katherine's waist and took her hand with the other. For a man who spent his days on horseback, Xavier moved with unexpected grace, guiding Katherine confidently around the room. Katherine felt the weight of the men's gazes, the significance of this public display. A blush rose to her cheeks as Xavier drew her slightly closer than propriety strictly dictated. "You dance well for a cattleman," she murmured. "My mother insisted I learn," Xavier replied, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "Said no son of hers would stomp around a dance floor like a wounded buffalo." Katherine laughed, relaxing into his lead. "She sounds formidable." "She was," Xavier agreed, a touch of sadness in his smile. "You would have liked each other." The waltz ended too soon, and Katherine stepped back, oddly breathless. The men applauded, several calling good-natured comments that made Xavier shake his head with a grin. Later, after the ranch hands had returned to the bunkhouse, and the house had fallen silent, Katherine and Xavier exchanged gifts by the dying fire. Her heart pounded as he unwrapped the journal, running his fingers over the embossed leather cover. "This is beautiful," he said, genuine pleasure in his voice. "Thank you, Katherine. I've been making do with scraps of paper for too long." "I thought you might use it for ranch plans," she said, pleased by his reaction. "Or perhaps other writing." Xavier nodded, setting the journal aside carefully before handing her a small package wrapped in brown paper. "It's not much," he said, suddenly seeming nervous. Katherine unwrapped it to find a small wooden box, intricately carved with wildflowers. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, lay a silver brooch in the shape of a rose. "Xavier," she breathed, lifting it carefully. "It's exquisite." "It was my mother's," he explained, watching her face. "She always said it should go to the woman who brought life back to this house." He cleared his throat. "That's what you've done, Katherine." The significance of the gift, a family heirloom, wasn't lost on her. Katherine pinned the brooch to her dress with trembling fingers, overwhelmed by the gesture. "Thank you," she said simply, unable to find adequate words for what she felt. Xavier reached out, his hand covering hers briefly. "Merry Christmas, Katherine." "Merry Christmas," she whispered back, acutely aware of the warmth of his touch and the unspoken currents flowing between them. That night, lying in her bed, Katherine held the brooch against her heart and allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she'd been avoiding. She was falling in love with Xavier Lawson. And judging by the look in his eyes when he'd given her his mother's brooch, she wasn't falling alone. January brought the harshest weather of the winter, with blizzards that confined everyone to the ranch buildings for days at a time. Xavier worried constantly about the cattle, venturing out with the men whenever the storms abated enough to check the herds. Katherine found herself watching anxiously each time he rode out, relief flooding her when he returned safely. Their relationship remained proper, but had taken on an undeniable tenderness. Xavier would bring her wildflowers he'd found on the range, preserved beneath the snow. Katherine would leave books she thought he might enjoy on his desk, marked passages she wanted to discuss. In February, a particularly vicious storm struck without warning. Xavier and two ranch hands were caught far from the house, forced to take shelter in a lined shack overnight. Katherine paced the floors until dawn, imagining the worst, only to collapse in relief when they rode in, half frozen but alive. That evening, after ensuring the men were warm and fed, Katherine found Xavier alone in the study, a glass of whiskey in his hand as he stared into the fire. "You should rest," she said from the doorway. "You've had a trying ordeal." Xavier looked up, fatigue etched in every line of his face. "I almost lost Johnson and Miller if we hadn't found that shack." Katherine entered the room, taking the chair opposite him. "But you did find it. You got them home safely." "This time," Xavier said grimly. "Ranching isn't forgiving of mistakes." "Neither is life," Katherine replied softly. "We make the best decisions we can with what we know at the time." Xavier studied her face, something unreadable in his expression. "Is that what you think about your marriage? That it was the best decision you could make at the time?" The question caught Katherine off guard. They rarely spoke of Thomas or her past. "I was young," she said carefully. "Thomas was charming, ambitious. He promised adventure when my life felt very small and prescribed." "You regret it, coming west with him?" Katherine considered the question seriously. "I regret that I didn't see Thomas clearly, that I gave up my independence so completely for his dreams." She paused. "But no, I don't regret coming west." Their eyes met across the space between them, and Katherine felt a pull that had nothing to do with gratitude or propriety. In that moment, she wanted nothing more than to cross the room, to offer comfort that went beyond words. But Xavier stood abruptly, setting down his glass. "You're right, I should rest." His voice was controlled, almost formal. "Good night, Katherine." Left alone in the study, Katherine wondered if she'd imagined the moment of connection, or if Xavier, too, was fighting against feelings that complicated their carefully balanced relationship. Spring arrived with a riot of wildflowers and the demanding work of calving season. The ranch hands moved the pregnant cows closer to the barn, and for weeks, everyone worked around the clock helping deliver calves. Katherine found herself assisting with the births, her initial squeamishness giving way to wonder at the miracle of new life. One particular night, a heifer was struggling badly. Xavier sent for Katherine, knowing her smaller hands might help where his could not. Together, in the lantern-lit barn, they worked to save both cow and calf, Katherine following Xavier's quiet instructions as she reached into the birth canal to reposition the calf. When the newborn finally slid free, both Katherine and Xavier were covered in blood and birth fluid, exhausted but triumphant. The tiny calf struggled to its feet, wobbling toward its mother who lowed softly in welcome. "You did well," Xavier said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Not many women would have the stomach for that. Not many women would have the opportunity," Katherine countered, watching the calf nurse for the first time. "Thank you for not treating me as too delicate for real work." Xavier handed her a clean rag. "You're the least delicate woman I know," he said, but his tone made it a compliment. As they walked back to the house in the pre-dawn light, Katherine felt a profound contentment. This life, hard work, purpose, connection to the land, and its rhythms suited her in a way her previous existence never had. In the kitchen, they washed up at the basin, taking turns with the soap and water. Katherine became acutely aware of Xavier's presence, the breadth of his shoulders, the way his damp shirt clung to his chest, the rare relaxation in his features as fatigue overtook tension. "We make a good team," he said quietly, drying his hands. "Yes," Katherine agreed, suddenly unable to look away from his face. "We do." Something changed in Xavier's expression, a lowering of guards, a decision made. He took a step closer, close enough that Katherine could feel the heat of his body, smell the clean scent of soap on his skin. "Katherine," he began, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. A pounding on the door interrupted whatever he had been about to say. Samuel's voice called urgently, "Boss, the red heifer's having trouble now." Xavier closed his eyes briefly, visibly gathering himself. "I'll be right there," he called back, then looked at Katherine with a mixture of regret and determination. "We'll finish this conversation later." But later proved elusive as the demands of the ranch consumed their days and exhaustion claimed their nights. The moment, whatever it might have become, passed unacknowledged, though Katherine often caught Xavier watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. In late April, nearly 6 months after Katherine had arrived at the Double L, a visitor came to the ranch, a wiry man on a tired horse, who introduced himself as Deputy Marshal Owen Fletcher from Denver. Xavier received him in the parlor, offering coffee that Katherine served before excusing herself. But as she worked in the kitchen, she couldn't help overhearing their conversation through the partially open door. "We've tracked Thomas Nash to Santa Fe," the deputy was saying. "He and the woman cleaned out 3 other mining operations before yours. They're facing federal charges for crossing state lines with stolen funds." Katherine froze, dish rag in hand, as Xavier asked, "Have you apprehended them?" "Not yet," Fletcher replied, "but it's just a matter of time. The territorial marshals have a description, and they've been spending money freely." "And what does this mean for Mrs. Nash?" Xavier's voice was carefully neutral. "Well, that's partly why I'm here," the deputy said. "We'll need her testimony when we catch him. Also, there's the matter of her legal status." "Legal status," Xavier echoed, an edge entering his tone. "Nash absconded with company funds, but also with his wife's property," Fletcher explained. "Under the law, a husband controls his wife's assets. However, given the circumstances, the judge is willing to grant Mrs. Nash a legal separation and restoration of property rights if we can recover any funds." Katherine set down the dish rag, her mind racing. A legal separation would free her from Thomas, give her control over her own financial affairs. It was more than she dared hope for. And what would that entail for Mrs. Nash? Xavier was asking, his voice tight. She'd need to come to Denver to sign papers, make statements. "Might have to stay for the trial whenever we catch Nash." Fletcher paused. "She working for you, Lawson, seems a fortunate arrangement for a woman in her position." "Mrs. Nash is my housekeeper," Xavier replied stiffly. "She's been an asset to the Double L." "I'm sure," Fletcher said, something insinuating in his tone. "Well, tell her I'll be back this way in about a week. She can ride with me to Denver if she's amenable." When the deputy had gone, Xavier found Katherine in the kitchen, her hands busy with bread dough though her mind was elsewhere. "You heard?" he asked without preamble. Katherine nodded, not looking up. "Yes." "Will you go to Denver?" Xavier's question held a weight beyond the simple words. Katherine punched down the dough with more force than necessary. "I should. It's a chance to be legally free of Thomas, to reclaim whatever he hasn't squandered." "Of course," Xavier agreed, but something in his voice made Katherine finally look up. His expression was carefully blank, but tension radiated from him. "The Double L will manage while you're gone." "Would I be welcome to return?" Katherine asked directly. "After the legal matters are settled," Xavier's eyes widened slightly. "You'd want to. This is my home now," Katherine said simply. "Unless you'd prefer I find other arrangements." "No," Xavier replied quickly, emphatically. Then, more measured. "No, your position here is secure for as long as you want it." Position. The word hung between them, inadequate for what had developed over the past months. Katherine wanted to address it, to speak plainly about the feelings that had grown between them. But Xavier's guarded expression stopped her. "Thank you," she said instead. "I'll go to Denver, settle what needs settling, and return as soon as possible." Xavier nodded, a muscle working in his jaw. "That's sensible." Sensible, Katherine thought as he left the kitchen. Such a bloodless word for decisions that would shape the rest of her life. A week later, Katherine found herself on the stagecoach to Denver, a small carpet bag containing her few good clothes beside her. The goodbye at the ranch had been awkward, with Xavier stiffly formal and the ranch hands openly disappointed to see her go. Only Samuel had spoken what everyone seemed to be thinking. "Don't stay away too long, Mrs. Nash," he'd said, pressing her hand. "The boss isn't himself when you're not around." Now, as the stagecoach lurched over the rutted road, Katherine wondered if she was making a mistake. Denver offered legal freedom and possibly some financial recovery, but the Double L offered something far more precious, a place where she belonged, work that fulfilled her, and a man who saw her true value, even if neither of them had found the courage to acknowledge what lay between them. Denver proved overwhelming after months at the ranch. The noise, the crowds, the constant activity exhausted Katherine as she navigated the legal proceedings. Deputy Fletcher had secured her lodging at a respectable boarding house for women, where she spent her evenings writing detailed letters to Xavier about her progress. His replies were prompt but frustratingly impersonal updates about the ranch, the calves, the weather. Nothing of what she truly wanted to know. Did he miss her? Was he, like her, counting the days until her return, 3 weeks into her stay, as Katherine was preparing to attend yet another meeting with the federal prosecutor? A commotion in the boarding house parlor drew her downstairs. There, hat in hand, looking utterly out of place among the feminine furnishings, stood Xavier. "Xavier," Katherine exclaimed, forgetting propriety in her shock. "What are you doing in Denver?" His eyes lit up at the sight of her, though he maintained a proper distance. "Ranch business." "Cattle contracts," he explained, then added more softly, "and I wanted to see how you were faring." The boarding house matron hovered nearby, clearly suspicious of this male visitor despite his respectable appearance. Katherine made quick introductions and received reluctant permission to sit with Xavier in the corner of the parlor, well within view. "The truth," Katherine said once they were seated, "ranch business wouldn't bring you to Denver in May." Xavier's lips quirked in a half-smile. "Perhaps I needed to see for myself that you hadn't been seduced by city comforts." "Hardly," Katherine replied with feeling. "I miss the ranch every day. The air here feels thick and the noise never stops." Relief flickered across Xavier's face. "Then you still plan to return?" "Of course," Katherine said, studying him curiously. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Xavier looked down at his hat, turning it in his hands. "Denver offers opportunities a ranch cannot. Education, culture, society, things a woman of your background might miss." "Things I left willingly when I came west," Katherine corrected gently. "The only thing I've missed is—" She hesitated, then continued with newfound boldness, "is you, the ranch, our life there." Xavier's head came up, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Our life," he repeated softly. Before he could continue, the boarding house door burst open, and Deputy Fletcher strode in, his expression triumphant. "Mrs. Nash, we've got him. Thomas Nash is in custody in Santa Fe. You'll need to identify some recovered property immediately." The moment shattered. Xavier stood, his expression closing. "You have duties to attend to," he said formally. "I won't keep you." "Xavier, wait," Katherine began, but he was already backing away. "I'll be at the Brown Palace Hotel until tomorrow," he said, "if you're free before I leave." And then he was gone, leaving Katherine torn between duty to her past and desire for her future. The identification of recovered property jewelry Thomas had given her, her father's pocket watch, and other personal items took hours. By the time Katherine returned to the boarding house, it was too late to call at the hotel. She wrote a note asking Xavier to wait, to give her time to explain what she truly wanted, but received no reply. The next morning, she went to the Brown Palace only to be told that Mr. Lawson had checked out at dawn. He'd left no message. Heartsick and confused, Katherine threw herself into finalizing her legal affairs with renewed determination. If Xavier had left without saying goodbye, she would have to accept that perhaps she'd misread his feelings. Pride kept her from immediately returning to the Double L, though every fiber of her being yearned for home. Instead, she accepted the prosecutor's offer to remain in Denver until Thomas's extradition and preliminary hearing. The recovered funds, a disappointingly small portion of what Thomas had stolen, would provide enough for her to establish herself independently if necessary. May turned to June, and Katherine found herself moving through each day mechanically, fulfilling obligations while her thoughts remained at the Double L. Had Xavier replaced her? Did the ranch house once again feel cold and empty? Did he sit alone by the fire in the evenings, reading the books they'd once discussed? Finally, in late June, Thomas arrived in Denver under heavy guard. Katherine steeled herself for the confrontation, unsure how she would feel seeing the man who had once been the center of her world. When Thomas was brought into the courthouse, Katherine barely recognized him. Gone was the handsome, confident man she'd married. In his place stood a haggard figure with haunted eyes. When he saw Katherine, he flinched visibly. "Katherine," he said, his voice hoarse, "you look well." "Better than you," she replied coolly. "Where is she?" "Your nurse." Thomas's gaze dropped. "Ran off in Santa Fe, took what was left of the money." Despite everything, Katherine felt a flicker of pity. Poetic justice, I suppose. The hearing was brief. Thomas offered no defense for his actions, agreeing to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. When asked about his wife's property, he admitted selling most of it, but directed authorities to a bank in Santa Fe, where he deposited a portion in Katherine's name, his attempt at restitution, however inadequate. Afterward, Katherine was permitted a private word with Thomas under the watchful eye of a deputy. "I'm sorry," Thomas said simply, "for everything. I wasn't the man you thought you married." "No," Katherine agreed, "you weren't. But neither was I the woman you thought you married. I should have been stronger, seen clearer." Thomas nodded slowly. "What will you do now?" Katherine thought of the Double L, of Xavier's face in the lamplight as they discussed books, of calves being born and bread rising and the simple rhythm of a life that had come to mean everything. "Go home," she said with sudden clarity. "I'm going home." 2 days later, Katherine boarded the stagecoach bound for Loveland, uncertain of her reception but determined to face whatever awaited her. The journey seemed interminable, each mile increasing her anxiety. What if Xavier had decided her absence was for the best? What if he'd hired another housekeeper? What if the connection she'd felt had been one-sided all along? By the time the stagecoach rolled into Loveland, Katherine's nerves were stretched to breaking. She collected her bags, now slightly more numerous with the additions of practical clothes purchased with her recovered funds, and arranged for them to be delivered to the Double L. Then, rather than waiting for transportation, Katherine began the 5-mile walk to the ranch. She needed time to organize her thoughts, to prepare for whatever reception awaited her. The June afternoon was warm, the road dusty beneath her sensible boots. Katherine had shed her city clothes for a practical skirt and shirtwaist that allowed for easier movement. As she walked, the familiar landscape soothed her anxious spirit: rolling hills, the distant mountains, wildflowers nodding in the breeze. She was about halfway to the ranch when she heard the sound of hoofbeats behind her. Katherine stepped to the side of the road, waiting for the rider to pass. Instead, the horse slowed and a familiar voice called her name. Xavier sat atop his chestnut stallion, staring at her as if she were an apparition. "Katherine, what are you doing walking from town?" "I couldn't wait for a ride," she said simply, her heart pounding at the sight of him. He looked leaner, the lines around his eyes more pronounced. "I needed to come home." Xavier dismounted in one fluid motion, standing before her on the dusty road. "I didn't know you were returning today." "I sent a telegram," Katherine said, frowning. 3 days ago." Xavier shook his head. "I've been at the North Pasture, just heading back now." He hesitated, then asked, "It's finished then? The legal matters?" "Yes," Katherine confirmed. "Thomas is in custody. I've been granted legal separation and control of my recovered assets." She paused, then added quietly, "I'm free." Something flickered in Xavier's eyes, hope quickly masked by caution. "And you've come back to the Double L?" "I've come home," Katherine repeated, taking a step closer. "If I'm still welcome." "Katherine," Xavier began, then stopped, seeming to struggle for words. "The house has been quiet without you." "Just the house?" she asked, her courage rising from somewhere deep inside. Xavier's expression softened. "No, not just the house." He reached out, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I missed you, every day." "Then why did you leave Denver without saying goodbye?" Katherine asked, the hurt she'd carried for weeks finally surfacing. "One moment we were talking about our life, and the next you were gone." Xavier looked away, his jaw tight. "When Fletcher arrived with news of your husband, I realized. You had a chance to reclaim your old life, your proper place in society." His eyes returned to hers, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen. "I didn't want to be the reason you settled for less than you deserve." "Less?" Katherine repeated incredulously. "You think the Double L is less?" "I think a housekeeper's position is less than what you should have," Xavier said, frustration edging his voice. "You deserve more, Katherine. A proper home, a proper place." "I have a home," Katherine interrupted fiercely. "With proper work that matters, with people who value me for my capabilities, not just my domestic skills." She stepped even closer, close enough to see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes. "With a man who sees me as I am, not as society says I should be." Xavier's breath caught. "Katherine, unless I've misunderstood," she continued, suddenly uncertain. "Unless what I felt, what I thought was growing between us was my imagination." "No," Xavier said hoarsely, his hands coming up to frame her face. "Not your imagination, never that." And then he was kissing her. There on the dusty road with the summer sun beating down and the wind carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers. Katherine wrapped her arms around his neck, returning his kiss with all the emotion she'd kept contained for months. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "I think I have since that first morning when you served me coffee strong enough to wake the dead." Katherine laughed, joy bubbling up inside her. "I loved you by Christmas," she admitted. "When you danced with me in front of everyone, looking at me like I was something precious." "You are precious," Xavier murmured, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "Too precious to be just my housekeeper." "Then what would I be?" Katherine asked, her heart thundering in her chest. Xavier stepped back slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. My wife, my partner, the mother of my children. He smiled, a rare full smile that transformed his face. The woman who brings life to every corner of the double L. Is that a proposal, Mr. Lawson? Katherine asked, happiness making her bold. The most important one I'll ever make, Mrs. Nash, Xavier replied, suddenly solemn again. I'm not a perfect man. I work too hard, worry too much, and sometimes forget to come in for dinner. But I promise to love you honestly, respect you completely, and build a life with you that honors who you truly are. Katherine felt tears prick her eyes. In that case, I accept. She reached up to touch his face, marveling that she could do so freely now. Though I should warn you, my cooking skills are still only modest at best. Xavier laughed, pulling her close again. Better than leather biscuits, he murmured against her lips before kissing her once more. They rode double back to the ranch, Katherine secure in the circle of Xavier's arms. As the buildings came into view, she felt a sense of rightness so profound it brought tears to her eyes. This was home not because circumstances had forced her here, but because she had chosen it, chosen him, chosen the life they would build together. The ranch hands emerged from the bunkhouse as they approached, their faces breaking into grins at the sight of Katherine. Samuel stepped forward, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Welcome home, Mrs. Nash," he said, then glanced at Xavier's arm around her waist and added with a wink, "Though I reckon we might be calling you something else before long." Xavier helped Katherine dismount, keeping her hand in his as they faced the men. "Mrs. Nash has agreed to become Mrs. Lawson," he announced, his voice carrying a pride Katherine had never heard before. "Assuming you hooligans don't scare her off before the wedding." A cheer went up from the men, followed by handshakes and congratulations. Katherine found herself enveloped in the genuine affection of these rough men who had become, in a very real sense, her family. That evening, after a celebration dinner that depleted the ranch's whiskey supply considerably, Katherine and Xavier sat alone on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. His arm was around her shoulders, her head resting against him in a newfound intimacy that felt both thrilling and perfectly natural. "I want a fall wedding," Katherine said, her fingers laced with his. "After the summer work is done, before winter sets in." Xavier nodded, brushing a kiss against her temple. "Whatever you want, though I'd marry you tomorrow if you were willing." Katherine smiled, turning to look at him. "Patience, Mr. Lawson. Good things come to those who wait." "I've been patient for a very long time," Xavier murmured, his eyes darkening as they traced her face. "But you're right. Some things are worth waiting for." As his lips found hers again, Katherine reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. Thomas's betrayal, which had seemed like an ending, had actually been the beginning of something far more precious, a love built on mutual respect, shared work, and genuine understanding. Her husband had left her at the mine with nothing, but in losing everything, she had gained what mattered most. A man who offered not just his home but his heart. 3 months later, on a crisp October day with the aspen trees blazing gold against the blue Colorado sky, Katherine stood in the bedroom that had once been hers alone, now transformed with new curtains, and a handmade quilt for the bed she would soon share with Xavier. Samuel's wife, Mary, who lived in town, fussed with Katherine's hair, weaving wildflowers through the simple upswept style. "You look beautiful, dear," Mary said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Xavier won't know what hit him." Katherine smoothed the front of her dress, not white, which seemed inappropriate for a widow, but a soft ivory silk that complemented her coloring. She'd ordered it from Denver, her one extravagance from the funds recovered from Thomas. "I'm nervous," Katherine admitted, touching the silver rose brooch pinned at her throat. which is ridiculous. I've lived under the same roof with the man for nearly a year." Mary chuckled, adjusting the flowers one last time. "Living with a man and being married to him are two very different things, my dear. Though you've had a better preview than most brides." A knock at the door revealed Samuel, dressed in his Sunday best, ready to escort Katherine downstairs. Xavier had insisted on following tradition, spending the previous night in the bunkhouse and refusing to see Katherine until the ceremony. "Ready, Mrs. Nash?" Samuel asked, offering his arm. "For the last time you'll be called that name." Katherine took a deep breath and nodded, placing her hand on his sleeve. "More than ready, Samuel." The ranch house had been transformed for the occasion. The parlor furniture had been moved aside, the floors polished to a shine, and every surface decorated with autumn flowers and ribbons. The ranch hands stood in a semicircle, cleaned up and uncomfortable in their formal clothes but beaming with genuine happiness. At the far end of the room stood Xavier, and the sight of him stole Katherine's breath. He wore a new black suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, his hair neatly trimmed, his face freshly shaved. But it was his expression as she entered that Katherine would remember for the rest of her life, a look of such profound love and wonder that tears sprang to her eyes. The minister from Loveland conducted a simple ceremony. Xavier's hand was steady as he placed a gold band on Katherine's finger, but his voice trembled slightly as he repeated his vows. Katherine's own voice grew stronger with each promise, her heart full to bursting as she pledged her life to this man, who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the minister declared, and a cheer went up from the assembled ranch hands as Xavier pulled Katherine into his arms for their first kiss as husband and wife. The celebration that followed was joyous and relaxed exactly what Katherine had wanted. Tables had been set up in the yard, laden with food prepared by the women of Loveland who had gradually accepted Katherine, once they understood she was to be Mrs. Lawson, not just the mysterious woman living at the Double L. As the afternoon turned to evening, lanterns were lit, and Samuel's fiddle came out for dancing. Xavier led Katherine in the first dance, holding her closer than he had at Christmas, his eyes never leaving her face. "Happy, Mrs. Lawson," he murmured as they moved across the impromptu dance floor. "Deliriously," Katherine replied, savoring the sound of her new name. "Though I'm looking forward to when all these people go home." Xavier's low laugh sent a shiver of anticipation through her. "Patience," he reminded her, echoing her words from months before. "Good things come to those who wait." Later, after the last guest had departed and the ranch hands had tactfully withdrawn to the bunkhouse, Xavier carried Katherine across the threshold of the bedroom that would now be theirs together. A fire burned in the small fireplace, casting golden light across the room. "Welcome home, Mrs. Lawson," Xavier said softly, setting her on her feet but keeping his arms around her waist. "I've been home for a long time," Katherine replied, reaching up to touch his face. "Since the moment you found me at the mine and offered me a place to belong." Xavier turned his head to kiss her palm. "I offered you a job," he corrected. "You made it a home." As his lips found hers in the firelit room, Katherine knew with absolute certainty that she had found where she was meant to be, not as a professor's daughter in Boston, not as a miner's wife at the Anderson Silver Mine, but as Xavier Lawson's partner on the Double L Ranch. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons: calving in spring, haying in summer, cattle drives in fall, long evenings by the fire in winter. The Double L prospered under their joint stewardship, with Katherine's financial acumen complementing Xavier's ranching expertise. They expanded thoughtfully, adding land when it made sense, improving their breeding stock, and gradually building one of the most respected cattle operations in Colorado. A year after their wedding, Katherine gave birth to a son they named James, after Xavier's father. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 2 years later, and then another son, William, the year after that. The ranch house, once so empty, now echoed with children's laughter and the happy chaos of family life. Katherine never heard from Thomas again. He served 5 years in prison for his crimes, and rumors suggested he'd headed to Alaska after his release, seeking fortune in the gold fields. Whatever became of him, he had no place in the life Katherine had built. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised Katherine with a trip to Denver, not for cattle contracts this time, but for a week of theater, fine dining, and the luxury of time alone together away from the ranch and children, left in the capable hands of Mary and Samuel. As they strolled arm in arm through the streets Katherine had once walked alone and heartsick, Xavier asked, "Do you ever miss city life? The conveniences, the society?" Katherine looked up at the man beside her, still handsome, though with more silver in his dark hair and deeper lines around his eyes that crinkled when he laughed with their children. "Not for a moment," she answered truthfully. "Everything I need is at the Double L." Xavier squeezed her hand, his expression tender. "You've given me more than I ever dreamed possible, Katherine. A family, a purpose beyond just building the ranch, a love I didn't think I'd find after a leaner." "You gave me those same gifts," Katherine replied softly. "When you found me at the mine with nothing, you offered me more than just your home." "I offered you my heart," Xavier finished, pulling her close despite the impropriety of such a public display. "Best decision I ever made." As they returned to their hotel, Katherine reflected on the journey that had brought her here from a privileged but constrained life in Boston, through the hardship and betrayal of her first marriage, to the joy and purpose she'd found with Xavier. Every step, even the painful ones, had been necessary to lead her home. That night, as Xavier slept beside her, Katherine whispered a silent prayer of gratitude for unanswered prayers, for paths not taken, and for the courage to begin again when all seemed lost. Her husband had left her at the mine with nothing, but in that moment of deepest despair, she had found everything: